Hey guys, Derek Ruiz here, apartment broker and expert with eXp Realty Commercial. And I'm bringing this video to you today to just go over how I solve the really complex, difficult, crazy deals out there and how I got the job done for this particular client. So let's jump right into it. Okay, the backstory on this particular deal. The seller purchased the property in 2021. It was 8 units, and the seller paid about $1,150,000 for it, I believe. It was not a good deal. It was in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. It was a rundown property, not well managed, and and I asked why the building was purchased, and was told that it was the end of a 1031 exchange, and the seller was running out of time, was kind of desperate to close something. So that's a good lesson for you folks. Never be in a rush to buy something, even if it's a 1031 exchange, because if you overpay for it, that's not a good situation, especially for a building that needs a lot of work and was not properly managed. So fast forward about 17 months, I get an email from the seller saying that the seller has some severe health problems and was no longer managing the property. The seller ended up deeding the property to one of her kids to handle selling the property. So the seller reached out and said, Derek, this person is going to be handling all of my properties and getting them sold. So the seller ended up actually quit claiming all the properties to her son to get everything sold, because the seller was just not going to be physically or mentally able to deal with, selling a building and going through escrow and signing and notarizing documents. Now, as an experienced investment property broker, the first thing I do when a seller is thinking about selling their property and asking me to do evaluations and stuff like that is I pull a preliminary title report to see what's on title, if there's any liens, tax liens or other kind of clouds on title that have to be cleared up. In this case, I needed all the documentation for the quit claim to her son. Now, the title companies, they don't really like when you just quit claim a property to a family member, because there's all kinds of fraud implications and signing things under duress. So as soon as I got the prelim done, I had the title company review everything. They were a little worried about the quitclaim deed, and their main issue, after I explained about the illness, their main issue was this done under duress? Did she have sound mind in order to notarize this deed and deed it over to her son? So fortunately, the seller had a good attorney friend that wrote a letter attesting to the sound mind of the seller, even though she was ill, to make this deed over to her son. So title accepted that letter from the attorney. So I solved that issue. And again, the first thing I ever do is clean up title issues when I'm going to be putting a property on the market. I don't want to be dealing with title during escrow. I want to get it fixed now, get it done. That's what a professional does. That's what I do. Clean that title. So that problem solved, title's clean, title's happy, and we're ready to move forward and put the property on the market. So the next problem I had to deal with was the overall poor condition of the property. To say it had problems was an understatement. This is probably one of the worst buildings I've sold in a long, long time. I was told by a family member that the seller didn't like to use licensed contractors because they were too expensive, and she preferred day laborers hired from Home Depot. Well, you get what you paid for, and what she paid for was a lot of shoddy work. Um, she had some kind of roofer do a new roof on the entire property, and you know how much it rained this winter. So again, even though she had a new roof, it leaked like a sieve. I had multiple tenants, when I was speaking to them, inviting me into their units to show where the water was seeping in their walls and their ceilings, and it was a mess. It was like a mold factory in there. So again, the finish work that she did on the tiles and the floors and the cabinets was a joke. You don't get skilled labor from Home Depot, as you well know. You want to hire competent, experienced, licensed contractors to do your work, unless it's a small job. So I knew that inspection issues and the overall condition of the property was going to seriously impact the price she was going to get for the property and the type of investor that was going to be buying this property. So on to the next issue that we had to solve on this crazy deal. The next problem I had to deal with was one of the tenants filed a frivolous lawsuit against the seller. I'm calling it frivolous. I'm sure he or she wouldn't call it frivolous, but in one of my previous videos, I highlighted the amount of lawsuits going on right now, 2024, that are filed against landlords by their tenants. It's just rampant right now. And sure enough, one of the tenants found a tenants' rights attorney that are out there advertising their service for low-income tenants, and they probably don't charge them anything to represent them. Here's some of the charges that were alleged against the seller. And some of these were legit. The first one, the seller of the property raised rents during COVID when she was not allowed to, when none of us were allowed to raise rents. She did it, and because these tenants are, low income, not that savvy, don't speak that good English, they just accepted the rent increase, even though they weren't supposed to get one. That was one of the complaints, the fact that she raised rents during COVID. So that was on her for sure. He also claimed the seller violated the LA Municipal Code anti-harassment ordinance against tenants. Also, he's alleging that she collected rents on an uninhabitable dwelling. He's claiming she retaliated against him. And he's also claiming she's illegally trying to evict him. So the seller did make some errors, and you can't do that kind of stuff nowadays, especially in Los Angeles, against your tenants. Now, the seller's son was not at all interested in talking to the attorney or dealing with the lawsuit. In his mind, the lawsuit was against the previous owner, not him. So he didn't want to deal with it. But I told him, this is going to be an issue with any buyer that buys a property. The fact that the tenant is suing the previous owner on this property and there's, code violations. So, we can't just sweep it under the rug. We have to disclose this and let the buyers know that, hey, there is a lawsuit. It's not against this current seller. It's against the previous seller. So I actually reached out to the attorney to talk to her, find out more details about what was happening. I got a copy of the lawsuit to read it over to understand what was going on. She said the previous owner was not responding to phone calls or mail or emails because she was ill and, she wasn't dealing with that kind of stuff. So the attorney wanted me to put her in touch with the new owner who was selling the property, but I didn't do that. And I told her that, you'll have to deal with it on your own somehow. The current owner was under the impression that he could just sweep it under the rug. It wasn't against me. It was against the previous owner. But the attorney said, well, we can, if we can go after the estate. I had to disclose this to the buyer. The buyer got a copy of the lawsuit to read it over. He wanted to be indemnified by the seller on the lawsuit. I didn't really know how to do that, but we just wrote it into the purchase agreement that the seller indemnifies the buyer against the lawsuit. Anyways, I think the seller kind of dodged a bullet with this lawsuit stuff. The deal closed. The seller has their money, and I guess the lawsuit will continue on, but it's over with as far as I'm concerned. So that was a kind of a weird wrinkle, but I have a feeling that I'm going to be seeing more and more, tenant lawsuits against landlords when I'm a listing broker and there's ongoing litigation. It's just the way things are now, unfortunately, 2024 in Los Angeles and California. Okay, next problem that I had to deal with on this crazy transaction. None of the tenants had written leases. When the seller bought the property, she never bothered to get written leases from any of the tenants, even though there was no existing leases when she bought the property. Guys, this is a big problem. If you buy a property that tenants don't have leases, please get them written agreements. to spell out all the terms of the tenancy. Now, I know that I believe in Los Angeles and maybe California, you can't force a tenant to enter into a new written lease agreement if they don't want to. So, but you got to at least try, you know, at least make the effort, get an attorney or a property manager and tell everybody, hey, we got to get everything on leases. We want to know where you park, if you have pets, how much your rent is, how much your deposit is, how many people are living in the unit, et cetera, et cetera. So it just makes it more difficult to sell a building when there's no leases because everything is murky and not spelled out. The buyers don't know exactly all the details about the tenant's tenancy. If there's no leases and we have to get estoppel signed, which is kind of a written statement signed by the tenant and the seller, what the exact terms of the lease are, how much rent is paid, how many people are there, what the deposit is, when the start date of the lease is, who pays for utilities, do they have parking, what's the laundry situation. So we can use estoppels if there's no leases, but in this case with these tenants, I was only able to get two tenants to sign estoppels. The rest of the tenants just wouldn't do it. They wanted to read it, they didn't understand it, and I just never got them signed. I had the seller sign the estoppels, and fortunately, I got the buyer to agree to just have the seller signing the estoppels, and I was able to solve that issue. Fortunately, the buyer was, cool about it, understood the situation. But guys, if you're in this situation, try to get written leases on your units. It'll save you a lot of headaches in the future, especially when it's time to sell. Okay, next issue. Of course, most of the tenants were not paying rent or were slow rent payers. The tenants were taking advantage of the seller by being late or not paying rent at all. With COVID and all the housing department rules changes, tenants can be very emboldened not to pay rent, especially if the seller was not paying close attention to collections every month. Now, again, the previous owner was ill and not doing a great job of managing the property, staying on top of people. And of course, the tenants took advantage of the situation. So I had to go, knock on doors and ask them about rent because, it's my responsibility as a listing broker to try to get things shipshape as much as possible. And the seller didn't have all the email or cell phone information for the tenant. So, I was there on Saturday morning knocking on doors, trying to, fill out information for tenants, what's your phone number, what's your email address, you know, when are you going to pay rent, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, that was a big pain in the butt trying to get it, herding cats and trying to get all these tenants to pay their rent. However, we were able to close escrow. The buyer accepted the fact that some of the tenants hadn't paid rent, and he was going to go after them for that. But, fortunately, that worked out, and the buyer was very cool about that. Next issue, it never ends with this property. I told you, the seller had been cited by the city for some unpermitted or not to code electrical work in one of the units. So, if you own a building in LA and it's a fixer-upper or it's run down, you're sure to have a visit from some point from those wonderful inspectors from the LA Housing Department. And of course, this property had been visited and was cited for some unspecified electrical issues, according to the seller. Now, since the seller fell ill, she left everything to the family member to deal with, and things got bounced around to everybody to fix. And I could never find the actual citation against the property with the city. I checked everywhere, LA Housing, Building and Housing, LA Housing Department, everything. I couldn't find it, but he insisted they had a citation, but he couldn't find the paperwork. The one vacant unit was torn apart. All the electrical boxes, all the electrical fixtures were torn apart. So I had this one unit, and the buyer kept on asking me, where's the citation? Where's the citation? I finally had to tell him there is no citation, in my opinion. I couldn't find one. The seller doesn't have one. Have your electrician, figure out what has to be done to the unit to put it back together, et cetera, et cetera. So fortunately, the buyer is very experienced, owns a lot of real estate in the area, has contractors on staff. So they figured out what was wrong. It wasn't that big of an issue, but he accepted the electrical situation, didn't make a big stink about it, fortunately, and just kind of said, okay, we'll take it as is with the electrical problem. So thank God for that, because with some buyers, this could have been a major issue. Okay, let me tell you how I found the right investor for this troubled, crazy 8-unit apartment building in Boyle Heights. First of all, let me tell you my criteria for any investor who is looking at this property. This had to be a cash deal. No loans, no way, not even hard money loans. They had to buy it cash or they're out. Number two, they had to have the property inspected before we opened escrow. I wanted the buyer to know all the problems with the property before we went into escrow. I don't want to open escrow and then have him come back, oh, we got this and we got that. No. So I had about 3 or 4 investors who were competing for the property bring their roofers and electricians out to the property first on a Saturday so they could go through the electrical system. They could figure out the roof situation. They could look at all the units and then decide if they were still interested in the property. So everybody did inspections before we accepted an offer. Number three, the buyer had to be very experienced. I didn't know newbie type buyers for this property. Obviously, all the buyers for this property had extensive multifamily experience and knew how to deal with these problem properties. So that was very important. They had to know the area, Boyle Heights, East LA, and they had to know and understand the tenant profile. The tenant profile for this property and the surrounding area was low income, Spanish speaking immigrants to the United States. That's who most of these tenants were. So they had to be comfortable and familiar with that tenant profile. They had to be able to handle repairs to properties. They had to have contractors, roofers, electricians, plumbers that they deal with to fix their own buildings all the time. They also had to accept the fact that there was a lawsuit pending against the previous owner on the property. So I told them, look, the previous owner, not the current owner, is being sued. I'm just disclosing that to you. You got to be okay with it. Um, they had to not care that there was no leases for any of the tenants. So, we tried our best to get estoppels. I was only able to get 2 tenants to sign, but that was one of the qualifications is accept the property with no leases. The other thing is they had to close within 30 days or less. This was not a deal that I wanted to be dragged out for 45 or 60 days. You buy the property all cash, we close quick, 30 days or less. The last thing, they had to release the deposit non-refundable after 7 days of removing contingencies. Again, non-refundable to the seller. So with the $30,000 deposit, after 7 days, they release contingencies. That deposit goes hard and is released to the seller non-refundable. So if they flake on us, they're losing $30,000. That is one of the most important ways to make sure the deal goes down and the buyer doesn't come and try to retrade or negotiate the deal once they're in escrow. So out of the 4 buyers, I picked who I thought was the best one, and he actually closed. He owned probably his investment firm probably owned 20 or 30 properties. A lot of them were in the Boyle Heights, East LA area, close by. So he knew the tenant profile, he knew the area. He didn't care about the lawsuit or the roof or the electrical or the leases or everything. Now, he negotiated $100,000 reduction in the price that we originally agreed upon. And I knew he was going to come back with some kind of retrade, but this was an ugly deal. The property had so many problems, lawsuits and electrical and no leases and no estoppels and just everything that was going wrong with this property. And, the current seller just wanted to get rid of this building in the worst way. He didn't want to manage it. He didn't want phone calls from tenants. He just wanted it out. So the buyer actually got this property at several $100,000 and the seller paid for it. But when you neglect a building and you don't buy it right the first place, you're going to lose money. And then unfortunately, the seller was ill. That was just the way it was. But fortunately, we got it done. It closed in about 2.5 weeks. Seller's stoked because this building is off the books. He has his money. No more hassle from anybody. He can live in peace now. And the buyer's going to go ahead and rehab the building and have a nice little acquisition under his belt. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this little video. Again, I just want to highlight that I can close the tough, craziest deals, especially when you got tenant issues. I'm an expert at rent control and dealing with tenants and dealing with buyouts. And I'm very fair, but very firm with tenants, and I don't mess around. I get things done. So, if you got a tough deal or you got a problem property or you got issues with tenants or lawsuits or anything, and you need to sell, give me a call. I've got 38 years of experience, investment property sales, residential property sales. Like I said, I'm a rent control expert. I'm an expert at dealing with tenants. I work with a lot of tenant attorneys and landlord attorneys to get things done for my sellers and my buyers and getting my listings sold. So again, you got tough deals, bring them to me. Thanks for watching, guys. Jarek Ruiz, eXp Realty commercial property, residential property, multifamily. I can help you with everything. Thanks for watching.